The ballroom glittered like a palace built for power. Crystal chandeliers poured golden light over polished marble floors. Waiters moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne, while a live orchestra played soft jazz beneath the hum of quiet conversations. Everywhere you looked, there were powerful people, executives worth billions, senators who shaped national policy, media figures who controlled the evening news. It was the annual charity gala, hosted by the most powerful tech CEO in the city. An event where influence was currency. And tonight, every important person wanted to be seen. Laughter echoed near the bar, deals were whispered in corners. Camera flashes from the press wall lit up the entrance like lightning. But near the edge of the ballroom, away from the center of attention, stood someone most people pretended not to notice. The CEO's daughter. 3 years ago, she had been the face of the company's future, brilliant, confident, and charismatic. The heir to an empire built from code and ambition. Then the accident changed everything. The scars across her face were impossible to ignore. Not grotesque, not horrifying, just enough to make people uncomfortable in a room obsessed with perfection. Guests glanced in her direction and quickly looked away. Some whispered behind raised glasses. Others offered polite smiles that vanished the moment she turned. No one said anything cruel out loud. But silence can sometimes be louder than insults. She stood, alone beside a tall marble pillar, hands folded gently in front of her black evening dress, watching the ballroom move without her. This was her first public appearance in years, and already the distance between her and the room felt enormous. Across the floor, I watched it all happen. I wasn't a billionaire. I wasn't a politician. Just someone invited to the event, another face among hundreds. But once I noticed her standing there, it became impossible not to see what everyone else was avoiding. It wasn't the scars. It was the loneliness. The orchestra shifted into a slow waltz, and couples began stepping onto the dance floor. Laughter rose as partners spun beneath the chandeliers. One by one, the most powerful people in the room took someone's hand, except her. She stayed exactly where she was. Watching. Waiting. Pretending she didn't mind. Something about that moment felt wrong. So before my brain had time to talk me out of it, I started walking straight across the ballroom. People noticed immediately. A few conversations stopped mid-sentence as heads turned. Where's he going? Is he walking toward her? Wait, is he serious? I could hear the whispers growing louder with every step. But by the time doubt finally caught up with me, I was already standing in front of her. Up close, her eyes held something I hadn't expected. Not anger. Not bitterness. Just exhaustion. The kind that comes from being seen as a symbol instead of a person. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I held out my hand. Would you like to dance? The room seemed to freeze. She looked at my hand like it was something fragile, something unfamiliar. For a second, I thought she might refuse, but then, slowly, she placed her hand in mine. Gasps rippled through the ballroom as we stepped onto the dance floor. Camera flashes flickered from across the room. Executives exchanged uncomfortable looks. A few guests stared openly now, no longer pretending not to watch. But once the music carried us forward, the crowd faded away. Halfway through the dance, she looked up at me. Her voice was quiet enough that only I could hear it. No one has asked me to dance in 3 years. The words landed heavier than the music, and in that moment I realized something simple. This wasn't just a dance. It was a crack in a wall that had been built around her for years. But while the entire ballroom watched the moment unfold with shock and curiosity, there was one person in the room watching more closely than anyone else: her father. The CEO *. Before the accident, the entire company knew her name, not because she was the CEO's daughter, because she was brilliant. Board members used to whisper about her like she was a force of nature. At 24, she was already sitting in strategy meetings most executives spent decades trying to reach. She spoke with calm confidence, the kind that made people listen even when they disagreed. Employees admired her, investors trusted her, journalists loved writing about her. They called her the future of the company, the golden child of $1 billion empire. At conferences, she spoke about innovation with a quiet kind of conviction. She shook hands with engineers, laughed with interns, debated policy with lawmakers. People walked away from those conversations convinced they had just met someone who would change the world. And in many ways, she was already doing it. Then one night changed everything. The accident happened on a highway just outside the city. Rain poured down the windshield while traffic crawled through the darkness. No one ever agreed on the exact cause. Some said another driver lost control. Others blamed the storm, but by morning, the headlines were everywhere. The CEO's daughter had been in a devastating crash. The car was destroyed. For hours, no one knew if she had survived. When doctors finally confirmed she would live, relief spread through the company like a wave, but survival came with consequences. The injuries left scars across her face, permanent reminders of a moment no one could undo. At first, the public response was sympathetic. News anchors spoke softly about recovery. Social media filled with messages of support. People said she was brave, resilient, inspiring, but sympathy online doesn't last forever. Within weeks, the tone changed. Gossip blogs began posting zoomed-in photos of her recovery. Anonymous comments turned cruel. Memes appeared mocking the scars, reducing a human being to a punchline. Every day, the internet found new ways to stare. Investors started calling the CEO privately. They didn't say anything openly heartless. They framed their concerns carefully, like people discussing market strategy instead of a human life. Public image matters. Brand perception matters. Maybe it would be better, they suggested, if she stayed out of the spotlight for a while, just until things settled down. Inside the company, the atmosphere changed too, not cruelly, quietly. Employees who once spoke to her easily now stumbled over their words. Some tried too hard to be kind, others avoided conversations entirely, terrified of saying the wrong thing. When she entered a room, people stopped knowing where to look. They looked at the floor. At their phones. At anything except her face. What hurt her most wasn't the cruelty online. It was the silence in real life. Conversations shortened, invitations disappeared. The same people who once admired her now treated her like fragile glass. Eventually, she stopped attending public events altogether. The CEO told everyone it was temporary. He said she needed time to recover, but privately he made a decision. He would control the narrative. No more press appearances. No more conferences. No more situations where cameras might capture the scars and turn them into another viral spectacle. He believed he was protecting her. From the media, from the internet, from the cruelty of strangers, but protection slowly turned into distance. Distance turned into isolation. And isolation turned into years of silence. Which is why tonight mattered. Tonight was supposed to be the moment she stepped back into the world. The first public appearance in 3 years, the ballroom, was full of powerful people who knew exactly who she was. Executives greeted her politely. Investors nodded respectfully. But the same pattern returned almost immediately. Conversations drifted away from her. Photographers positioned their cameras carefully, avoiding angles that might show the scars too clearly. No one wanted to embarrass the CEO. No one wanted to risk awkwardness. So they did the safest thing possible. They ignored her. And then something disrupted the entire system. One ordinary guest crossed the ballroom and asked her to dance. It was such a small gesture, but in a room full of people trained to protect power, even a small disruption can feel dangerous. Across the ballroom, the CEO had been watching. At first, he simply noticed the movement on the dance floor. Then he recognized who his daughter was dancing with. His expression changed. He leaned toward one of his executives and asked a quiet question that carried far more weight than anyone realized. Who is that man dancing with my daughter? And suddenly, a simple act of kindness was about to become something far bigger than a dance. The music slowly faded, and the final notes of the orchestra drifted through the ballroom like a question no one wanted to answer. For a moment, there was silence, then came the applause. It wasn't loud, it wasn't enthusiastic. Just a scattering of polite claps from people who didn't quite know how to react. Some guests smiled awkwardly. Others avoided eye contact entirely. A few whispered behind raised glasses as if the entire dance had broken some invisible rule. I stepped back slightly, letting go of her hand as the dance ended. She looked lighter somehow, like a weight had shifted off her shoulders for the first time all night. But before either of us could say another word, the atmosphere in the room changed. People began moving aside, conversations died mid-sentence, and suddenly there was a clear path cutting through the center of the ballroom. Her father was walking toward us. The CEO didn't need to raise his voice or demand attention. His presence alone had that effect. This was a man who spent his days negotiating billion-dollar deals and making decisions that shaped entire industries. When he entered a room, people noticed. When he walked toward someone, they felt it. I suddenly realized that what had felt like a simple human moment might have crossed into dangerous territory. He stopped a few feet away. For a second, he didn't say anything. His eyes moved from his daughter to me, studying my face like he was trying to understand something. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the orchestra had stopped pretending to play. Finally, the CEO spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge underneath it. Why did you ask her to dance? The question landed in the center of the ballroom like a dropped glass. People leaned slightly closer, pretending not to listen. Most of them expected the same thing. An apology, a nervous laugh. Maybe some polite excuse about being a fan of the family, or wanting to honor the host. I could feel dozens of eyes waiting for the safe answer. But the truth came out before I had time to soften it. I saw someone standing alone. I said quietly. A few people shifted uncomfortably. The CEO said nothing. So I continued. Everyone else in the room saw it too. I added, they just pretended not to. The words seemed to ripple through the crowd. I took a breath before finishing the thought. I didn't see scars. I said, I saw someone everyone else was afraid to treat normally. You could almost hear the air leave the room. A few executives exchanged quick looks that said the same thing. This conversation was not going the way they wanted. For a moment, the CEO's expression didn't change, but beside me, his daughter looked stunned. Not offended, not angry. Just surprised. Like she had never heard someone say those words out loud in front of everyone before. Round the ballroom, the tension thickened. People were waiting for the CEO to respond. Instead, something unexpected happened. His daughter spoke. At first her voice was soft, almost uncertain, but as she continued, it grew steadier. He's not wrong, she said. The statement landed harder than anything I had said. Several guests looked down at the floor. Others suddenly became very interested in their phones. She looked round the ballroom slowly, meeting the eyes of people who had known her for years. After the accident, everything changed. She continued. Not all at once, just little things. Her voice remained calm, but every word carried weight. Conversations started ending faster. People stopped looking me in the eye. Invitations disappeared. She glanced briefly toward the executives standing near the stage. No one said anything cruel. She added, that would have been easier. A few nervous laughs died quickly in the silence. What hurt was how careful everyone became. She paused, like I wasn't a person anymore. The room had gone completely still now. The orchestra members stood frozen behind their instruments. Waiters stopped moving between tables. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. For years, she continued quietly, people treated me like something fragile. Like one wrong word might break me. Her eyes drifted toward me for a moment. Tonight was the first time in a long time that someone didn't. Then she said something that sent another ripple through the room. You're the only person tonight who didn't look at me like a tragedy. No one spoke. Not the executives. Not the guests. Not even the CEO. Because for the first time since the accident, the truth was standing in the middle of the ballroom where everyone could see it. And the person hearing it most clearly was the one man who had spent years trying to protect her. From exactly this moment. Her father, the CEO, stood there in silence for several seconds. His expression unreadable. People held their breath, waiting to see what he would do. Some expected anger, others feared embarrassment. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried something no one in the room had predicted. Because the CEO wasn't angry. He was about to say something that would change the entire room. For several long seconds, The CEO didn't move. The ballroom held its breath. Hundreds of powerful people stood frozen beneath the chandeliers, waiting for the response that would decide how this moment ended. In a room like this, silence carried its own gravity. It pressed against the walls, against the marble floor, against every person pretending not to stare. The CEO's eyes moved slowly from his daughter to me, and then across the crowd surrounding us. Executives, investors, journalists. People who had spent years studying his every expression, trying to predict the decisions that shaped industries. But tonight, none of them knew what was coming. Finally, he stepped forward. For a moment, I thought he might be angry, maybe not shouting, maybe not humiliating, but the controlled kind of disapproval powerful men deliver when someone crosses a line. Instead, he did something no one expected. He extended his hand toward me. The entire room seemed to lean forward. "Thank you," he said. The words landed like thunder in a quiet valley. A wave of confusion rippled through the crowd. Several executives exchanged stunned looks. One reporter instinctively raised a phone to start recording. The CEO turned slightly toward his daughter, his expression softer now. "For years," he continued slowly, "I believed I was protecting her." His voice carried clearly across the ballroom. "I thought keeping her away from the cameras, away from the headlines, away from rooms like this, was the best thing I could do as a father." He paused, the weight of the admission settling over the audience. "But tonight," he said quietly, "I realized something." He looked directly at his daughter. "I wasn't protecting you." The words hung in the air. "I was isolating you." Murmur spread through the guests. The CEO exhaled slowly, as if saying the truth out loud had taken more courage than any boardroom negotiation he'd ever faced. "I told myself the world was the problem," he continued, "that if I could just control the narrative, control the environment, control who saw you." He shook his head slightly. "I convinced myself that silence was safety." He gestured gently toward the room around us. "But silence has a cost." Across the ballroom, several people shifted uncomfortably because they understood exactly what he meant. The CEO turned fully toward the audience, now the investors, the executives, the media figures who had helped build his empire. "My daughter doesn't need protection from the world," he said. The room grew perfectly still again. "The world needs to learn how to treat her with dignity." For a split second, no one reacted. Then the applause began. It started slowly, just a few claps, from somewhere near the back of the ballroom. But the sound grew quickly, spreading from table to table like a wave breaking across the room. Soon the entire ballroom was applauding, not politely this time, not awkwardly. The kind of applause that happens when something honest finally breaks through the surface of a carefully controlled environment. His daughter stood beside him, stunned, and for the first time since the accident, her smile wasn't careful. It was real. The CEO looked at her for a moment longer, then turned toward the orchestra. "Play another song," he said. The musicians exchanged surprised glances, but within seconds the soft opening notes of a new melody began drifting through the room. Guests watched curiously as the CEO stepped forward onto the dance floor. He stopped in front of his daughter. For a brief moment, the powerful executive, who ran one of the largest tech companies in the world, looked less like a titan of industry and more like a father hoping he hadn't waited too long. He held out his hand. "May I have this dance?" Her eyes glistened slightly under the chandelier light. Then she laughed softly and placed her hand in his. The crowd watched in silence as father and daughter stepped onto the dance floor together. Phones lifted everywhere. Journalists who had arrived, expecting another predictable corporate charity event, suddenly realized they were witnessing something far more powerful. The CEO guided his daughter gently across the floor while the music filled the room, not as a public statement, not as a performance, but as a moment years in the making. Somewhere in the crowd, someone whispered, "This is going to be everywhere tomorrow." And they were right. By morning, the video would spread across social media. Millions of people would watch the moment when a father chose honesty over image and dignity over silence. But even as the applause faded and the evening slowly began winding down, one final moment was still waiting to happen, because before the night was over, The CEO's daughter would approach me one last time, and what she said in that quiet moment would become the reason this story was remembered long after. The music stopped. By the time the music softened and the final dance ended, the ballroom felt like a completely different place. The chandeliers still glowed above the marble floor. The same executives still stood in small circles with their glasses of champagne. The same reporters still moved carefully between conversations, chasing stories that might appear on tomorrow's front pages, but something had shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just different. Earlier in the evening, people had carefully avoided the CEO's daughter. Conversations had drifted away from wherever she stood. Eyes had moved quickly to the floor or toward the nearest distraction. Now the distance was gone. Guests approached her naturally, one after another. Some introduced themselves for the first time, even though they had attended the same events for years. Others spoke to her about the company, about ideas, about the future. The conversations were no longer stiff or overly careful. They were simply normal. Across the room, I watched it happen. She laughed during one conversation near the stage. A group of young employees spoke to her excitedly about a project they were working on. One of the investors, who had earlier kept his distance, now stood beside her discussing something with genuine interest. For the first time all night, she wasn't standing alone, and maybe, for the first time in years, she didn't feel like the room was quietly waiting for her to leave. Eventually the evening began winding down. Waiters cleared empty glasses from the tables. Guests started gathering their coats. Conversations shifted toward goodbyes and promises to meet again soon. I slipped quietly toward the exit, not wanting to interrupt the momentum that had finally formed around her. The truth was, I hadn't expected any of this. I had only asked someone to dance. Nothing more. I was almost at the doors when I heard footsteps behind me. "Hey," I turned. She was walking toward me. The noise of the ballroom seemed to fade slightly as she stopped a few steps away. For a moment neither of us spoke. The glow from the chandeliers reflected softly in her eyes. Up close, the scars were still there, but somehow they felt smaller now. Or maybe the room had simply learned to see past them. "I was hoping I'd catch you before you left," she said. Her voice carried that same quiet steadiness I remembered from the dance. I didn't get a chance to say thank you. "You don't need to thank me," I replied. But she shook her head gently. "Yes, I do." She glanced briefly back toward the ballroom, where guests continued to gather round her father, still talking about the speech that had changed the tone of the entire night. "You did something most people in that room couldn't do," she continued. "Which was, you treated me like a normal human being." The words weren't bitter, they were simply honest. "For 3 years," she said softly, "people have either looked at me with pity or avoided looking at me at all." Her eyes met mine again. "You didn't do either." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just stood there quietly while she continued. "That dance might have seemed small to you," she said, "but to me it felt like someone opening a window in a room that had been closed for a long time." She hesitated for a moment, like she was choosing her final words carefully. Then she smiled. "I won't forget you." It wasn't romantic. There was no dramatic music swelling behind the moment, no grand promise about what would happen next. It was something simpler, the recognition of a moment when someone had chosen empathy over fear. A moment when kindness had interrupted a pattern that had lasted far too long. I nodded, wishing her good night, and stepped out into the cool air beyond the ballroom doors. Life returned to normal after that evening. Or at least, it seemed that way at first. But a few weeks later, the ripple from that night appeared in a way no one had expected. The company announced the launch of a new foundation. Its mission was simple but powerful, supporting burn survivors and accident victims, advocating for dignity, opportunity, and visibility in a world that often turned away from scars. At the launch event, cameras gathered once again, but this time, the CEO wasn't the focus. His daughter stood at the center of the stage. Confident, steady, speaking about resilience, about compassion, about building a world where people weren't defined by the worst moment of their lives. She wasn't hidden. She wasn't protected. She was leading Watching the broadcast later, I realized something that had never crossed my mind that night. Sometimes the smallest gesture can travel further than we imagine. A single invitation, a single dance, a single moment of choosing humanity when it would have been easier to look away. Kindness is rarely dramatic, but sometimes it changes everything.